Now available in paperback and e-readers, Isis, Samurai Goddess. The goddess next door takes on kung fu killers in this action-packed martial arts Isis series adventure. Get Isis, Samurai Goddess in paperback and e-readers today. One of my viewers, Brother Cap, asked me to discuss the differences between DC and Marvel these days. And as it relates to DC and Marvel comics these days, there's not really that much difference between them, except for the difference between the catalog of characters. While DC has Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, and Marvel has Spider-Man, Iron Man, Captain America, and the Hulk, there is no real difference between the two as it relates to their editorial departments. And because there is no real difference between the two as it relates to their editorial departments, they're pretty much both producing some pretty mediocre comics. And one of the core reasons why both companies are not producing really good quality comics these days is because both of their editorial departments pretty much have a complete lack of vision. And this lack of vision is preventing them from being able to reach new customers in the 21st century. When you look at DC and Marvel, both of them pretty much are not being run in a way that pretty much allows them to maximize their potential and pretty much reach that new generation of readers. When you look at many of the products being produced there's just nothing really compelling to anyone. Now, I remember as a kid back in the 1980s that comics were pretty much, they were fun because most comics were pretty much easy to access and pretty much easy to follow. But these days, because of this lack of vision, comic books are extremely complicated at both DC and Marvel. And one of the big problems at DC and Marvel relates to their story model. Now these days, as it relates to story models, everything is about these big events. Over at DC, they're having this rebirth event, and over at Marvel, they just do random events. And this model pretty much takes up the entire catalog of titles, and it becomes pretty much very difficult for a new customer to follow because everything is tied into this event. And unless you're a long-time comic fan, you're going to have a hard time accessing the characters and getting into the story. Now, when I was a kid, we used to have something called 3 to 5 issue story arcs. And usually over the course of 2, 3, or 5 issues, a reader could jump on and jump off based on the stories and based on the characters, because everything was pretty much character driven, because originally the comic book model was a character driven model at both DC and Marvel. Everything was about letting people recognize characters, and as they recognized the characters, they picked up the comic based on the character, and then they got into the story, and that's what made them become interested in collecting this character's adventures. Everything was character based. But these days, everything is pretty much event-based, and everything is about some big, long story. Now, this story model, when it was introduced by Jim Shooter in the 1980s, was originally meant to help new readers get to know characters. And unfortunately, it has evolved into a monster at both DC and Marvel. And ironically, it makes it harder for new customers to access the product. Originally, the event model was, again, meant to help people get introduced to comics in events like Secret Wars, which were taken outside of the universe. And then as the event wound down, you then went to go look at these characters in their own comics. And then later, as the event model evolved, it was designed to pretty much get new readers to try new titles or second or third tier titles. And this was done very well in an event in 1989 called Acts of Vengeance. Now, Acts of Vengeance was pretty much established by John Byrne, and he came up with that idea of superheroes switching their opponents. Instead of them fighting their traditional rogues in their rogues gallery, they would switch up. And this was a really successful event because it introduced new matchups and, in some cases, established new feuds, and it allowed people to try out those second and third tier titles, and that pretty much help people get into comics, because a lot of the second and third tier titles, when there's a event, what happens is people want to try to buy that other title to see what happens in this story. But when John Byrne did it in Acts of Vengeance, what happened was it was pretty much a very easy storyline to follow. Everybody pretty much had their own adventures in their own books, but just that the villains were switching things up and taking on different heroes. And some of this taking on different heroes really got people interested, because you were seeing villains coming out of their rogues gallery, and then you had to see heroes trying different things to overcome the challenges as they fought these different heroes. So that event was a very successful event. Unfortunately, these days we get these big mega crossover events, and it again makes it impossible for the new reader and even some older readers like myself to even understand what's going on. Everything is just so jumbled and so hard to follow that you pretty much need Wikipedia to pretty much help you understand what happens. And this is really bad for the comic book industry, because it just shows a lack of vision editorially. In some ways, it makes the industry look extremely lazy, because what they do is just say, hey, let's just put an event out here and not really try to develop these characters. And a lot of these writers and editors, they don't know what these characters' missions are. They don't know what direction to take them in. And that's something you would learn as you pretty much wrote the characters on their own in their own adventures. And this is a big problem with both DC and Marvel, is that nobody is getting to know the characters. They know them as related to events, but they don't know what makes them special. They don't know what makes them distinct, and they don't know what makes them pretty much unique. So the characters at both companies are pretty much losing their voices, and more so at Marvel these days than DC, because at Marvel these days, what's the big problem is over there is that Axel Alonso decided he was going to pretty much cater to these social justice warriors and diversify Marvel in the worst way. And as a black man, I look at the way he diversified Marvel, and the whole execution of the concept was just, it was off the rails, because he wanted to call himself diversifying Marvel not by introducing new characters of color from different creators of color. He decided what he was going to do was take old established characters and then give them different ethnicities. And that's how we got a black female Iron Man, an Asian Hulk, a female Thor, a black Captain America. And most comic fans who pretty much grew up with the white guys had no real reason to buy these adventures. So Marvel sales pretty much plummeted as a result of this diversity campaign. And when I look at that diversity campaign, it was one of the worst things that Marvel ever did. And the reason why they did it, again, is because they creatively have a lack of vision. They creatively have a lack of direction. Your Axel Alonso really does not understand how to reach readers in the 21st century. So he does this diversity gimmick in the hopes of catering to social justice warriors, but not understanding that your average social justice warrior, pretty much, they complain a lot, but when it's time to put money on the table, they are nowhere to be found. And this is why Marvel is struggling right now, because they've pretty much alienated their core customer base, and now that their customer base has walked away, they're desperately struggling trying to get those customers back. And this is another problem that's over at DC, because in 2011 they decided they wanted to end their DC universe and then start fresh. And this was the vision of Warner Brothers executives and editors like Dan Dido, who decided they wanted to give us a new version of Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, and Green Lantern. And that pretty much fell flat as well, because comic fans, again, who were buying these comics for years, pretty much walked away. And they walked away because they said that they had no incentive to buy the characters, because the characters they knew no longer were part of the DC universe. So DC now is scrambling with Rebirth to try to get those customers back. And all of this is happening because both companies lack a vision for the 21st century. When it comes down to the 21st century, they have made a lot of stumbles, and they made those stumbles because they just don't know how to compete. Comics these days pretty much provide the lowest entertainment value per dollar, because these comic editors have no vision. Now, comic books these days, they really have to compete against a lot of media they didn't have to compete with, including superhero movies and superhero TV shows. And what really makes it really a serious competitive market for comic books these days on the publishing side is that these comic books are pretty much, again, have the highest entertainment value per dollar at $5 an issue. And then when you compound this with the event model, what happens is these comics start costing $500 and $600 just to complete a single story. And when you put that up against 99-cent ebooks on Smashwords, or $2.99 and $3.99 ebooks like I produce, the entertainment value for a comic just it becomes overpriced. And when you put it up against other social media such as Twitter or Facebook or YouTube videos, which pretty much cost nothing, the value per dollar of a comic pretty much gets lower, gets higher and higher. And then when you put it up against Netflix, which gives you a subscription, or Amazon's streaming, it really starts to drop. And then it's like, I mean, not drop, but it continues to go up. So the entertainment value per dollar of a comic, it has pretty much gone up over the last couple of years, whereas the entertainment value of new media has declined over the years, to the point where customers go with this media because it's a lot cheaper. I mean, it's a lot cheaper for a Netflix subscription than a Marvel Comics subscription, and that pretty much is encroaching on the market for the publications. And this is something the editors just don't see. And what really exacerbates that problem at Marvel and DC both is the lack of vision from their editorial departments, because their editorial departments just don't know how to reach the 21st century customer. In some ways, they don't even know how to reach the 20th century customer, because they have a story model, again, that is focused on events, not on developing the characters or making the characters accessible to today's customers. So when I look at Marvel and DC, they both have this vision issue, and that's all due to their editorial department. Now, when I look at Dan Dido from the front at DC Comics, and many of the people who work for him, like Jeff Johns, they pretty much lack a vision because there's no one there with a publishing background. I mean, when you have a publishing background like I do, you understand how to sell to the reader in the print market. And the print market is completely different than other forms of media, even ebooks, because both, even though ebooks are published, they are a completely different market, and you have to know how to sell to those different markets. And when it comes down to publications, they just don't understand that comics cannot be big events. They have to be pretty much sold in a way that helps the new customer come in. This is why I can agree with Jim Shooter when he talked about every story being an entry point, every issue being an entry point, because the new readers don't want to be dictated to like they are at Marvel and DC right now, where they tell you, oh, this is the entry point. No, that everybody's going to find different books as they go along. Some people are going to come in on an old book they find in their friend's house, or an old book they find in a family member's house. Others are going to come in on a brand new book that they pretty much pick up. This is something I have learned myself pretty much publishing the SJS Direct Universe, because I've had people come in on Isis the Beauty Myth or Isis All About the Goddess, and those were the books they came in, and those books were published later in the Isis series, because I started it in 2012 and those books were published in 2013. And I've had people come in on later books like Bride of Dracula, which was published in 2016. So they come in when they want to come in, based on the stories they want to pick up. And this is something that just is part of the business. People are going to pick up what they want to pick up when they want to pick up. You can't tell them when to pick it up. This is why the comic story model has always been 2, 3, or 5 issue arcs, so the new reader can have incentive to buy in. Unfortunately, there is no entry point, so many customers just feel frustrated, and many older customers are frustrated because many of them are upset because you've pretty much changed all the characters they knew. And what many people in the comic book business just don't understand is that when you lose a customer, it's harder to get more customers to replace them. And in the case of the comic book industry, they've been hemorrhaging customers since the 90s. And this is something I understood about marketing, about customers, is that it often takes 3 customers to get one back, because when you lose one veteran comic customer, you're going to need 3 to get them back. And these days, you can't get the 3 customers because of the price and the distribution, because many comics these days are sold only in comic shops and Barnes and Nobles, and a lot of people don't really go to get comics on digital, so there really aren't many venues to get them like they were back when I was a kid, where we had grocery stores, supermarkets, Kmart's, Walmart's, Fridays. We had all those type of stores that sold comics, but these days they don't have that, because they pretty much, the Heroes World distribution disaster of the 1990s pretty much closed that venue off when Marvel bought Heroes World and changed the distribution model. So there's only one distributor for comics, which is Diamond. So if you put out a comic, it's pretty much through Diamond, and again, those comics are non-returnable. Again, that goes back to the lack of vision, and a lot of these guys just don't know how to build demand for their products because they don't have a vision for the 21st century as it relates to superheroes. Superheroes, as I see it, are pretty simple. It's good guys versus bad guys, and that's what people want. They want comics that are family friendly because a lot of people, they're in their 40s like I am, and they want comics they can give to their children and share their favorite characters with their children. They want, all ages action and adventure. They want something that's fun. Unfortunately, just like these superhero movies, like on the Marvel Studios brand, but they're not getting that from from the publishers these days. Instead of the publishers these days, they're giving them these long drawn out events, or like SJW Marvel, they're trying to ram a political message down their throat, and that's not what the customer wants. What the customer wants is something similar to what I'm trying to do here at SJS Direct. Just give you basic good guys versus bad guys in simple, easy to follow stories where you pretty much pick the entry point and you pick the adventure you want to follow and you pick the stories you want to follow. And if you like what you see, you'll continue to pick up the next adventure. And if you don't like what you see, you can try something else. That's the beauty of comic books and comic collecting, is that you always have choices. Unfortunately, what happens these days with these editors and their lack of vision is they want to pretty much tell you they're going to choose for you instead of letting you choose for yourself, and they're going to try to tell you what to like instead of letting you choose what you want to like. And that's what's really bad about today's comic book market, is that they want to tell you what to buy and where to start. And as I see it, if I were running Marvel and DC, I would be trying to go back to 2 and 3 issue arcs, letting those characters be themselves, and letting people find what they like, and letting them pretty much do what they want to do and choose what they want to choose. And that's pretty much been worked in comics for over 75 years. And I believe that model could pretty much work again if it was allowed to be put into place, and you had creators who had a vision for creating great stories, because I see a lot of great artists out there who pretty much show that they have a lot of talent and they're good at storytelling, but they're pretty much working in the indie market. And if I was pretty much running Marvel, I would try to bring some of those guys in and try to make these characters fresh again. And as I look at Marvel and DC these days, again, I don't see much difference-wise as it relates to their editorial departments, and that's why the products are pretty much so bad these days, and why customers are having a hard time buying comics in a time when superheroes are at their height of popularity thanks to these superhero movies. If you want to try out many of the books in the SJS Direct universe, you may do so by clicking the link to the Amazon.com in the description box. And if you want to like this channel and you like what you see on this channel, you can donate to it by clicking the link to the Patreon in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.